Welcome to Tech Trends. Tech Trends is a podcast series that provides perspective on the latest trends in technology, fintech, and digital. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And as we do every year, on today's episode, we're going to provide insight into the important role that cybersecurity plays in today's business and technology agendas. I'm Anish Bhimani, Chief Information Officer for Commercial Banking. And joining me today is Annie Davis, Head of Cybersecurity and Technology Controls for Commercial Banking here at jpmorgan Chase. Annie, welcome to Tech Trends.
Thanks, Anish. Very excited to be here today.
So, Annie, about a year ago, we had your colleague JF Legault on talking about the impact that the pandemic had on the cybersecurity landscape. A year later, can you talk a little bit about how we're thinking about the cybersecurity threat and COVID's impact on it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been quite a year. Obviously, a year ago, we were talking a lot about the cyber threats that are targeting very COVID-specific activities, whether it was the Paycheck Protection Program or small business debt relief, that type of thing. We're not seeing as much of that now. So that's really slowed down. It's the more traditional attack vectors and themes that we're seeing. But I will say the volume of attacks, especially when you look at business email compromise, phishing, smishing, the volumes are still really high and increasing. And part of that's due to the ongoing amount of change in our environment, as well as the anxiety with the changing situation. So it's still a really good attack vector for those cyber criminals to really take advantage of that anxiety and hope that people aren't looking as closely at their emails and that type of thing and still clicking on links, which we continue to see a rising amount of.
So it's clear that the environment caused by COVID really did create a very fertile ground for attackers. And while we're still dealing with that, I think people are starting to get adjusted maybe a little bit to a new normal. What are some of the cybersecurity risks that we are seeing today in the current environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the two largest areas where we're seeing an increase is in ransomware and supply chain attacks. Ransomware alone, the number of attacks in the first half of the year are as much as we saw in 2020. So we've seen over 300 million attempted attacks in the ransomware space. And to step back, ransomware, simply put, is basically a bad actor is able to gain access to your network, and they're able to take your network over to the point where you're essentially locked out of your network or locked out of your data or that type of thing. And in order to regain access to your network, you typically have to pay ransom to unencrypt the network. We are seeing more and more of this. You saw it with Colonial Pipeline earlier this year or late last year. Where Colonial had to take their systems offline to address a ransomware attack, which essentially impacted many of us in our ability to get gas as they had to slow down the pipeline. So you're seeing how it impacts broadly. Even more broadly are the supply chain attacks. So put simply for that, a cyber criminal will attack one target, but that target is typically one that then supplies services to multiple companies. So I can attack that one target, insert malicious code, and then as other companies update that software, they inherit that malicious code. So we've essentially pushed out a significant impact much more broadly than attacking one company or one firm. So we've seen that quite a few times as well this year. SolarWinds is the one that we saw that ultimately impacted the US government and other companies who were use that provider of software. Probably most recently, you've seen the Kaseya attack, which was interesting because it was a combination of both the service provider attack as well as the ransomware attack. So they were able to take advantage of that supply chain and also lock multiple people out of their systems as a result of being both supply chain and ransomware.
So ransomware has been around for a long time and supply chain attacks even longer, right? Why now? What's causing this uptick in the number of attacks?
Yeah, so Anish, I think because we've seen a lot of success in those attacks and those vectors, it's just really added, fuel to the fire that we're seeing a lot of ransomware paid. We're seeing really them being successful. So they're taking more advantage of it, and you're seeing it almost ransomware as a service at this point. being able to take advantage of those companies. The more they see the success, the more they'll continue to do it, which is why it's so critical for us to work across industries, work public and private, to implement controls and processes to help slow that down and stop that moving forward.
One of the other points that always gets made as well is that when an attack first comes out, it's really sophisticated, it's very difficult to do, but over time you mentioned ransomware as a service, you get to a point where there's almost like toolkits that can make it much easier for other people to conduct these kind of attacks. Is that part of it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, it's getting easier and more successful. Though if you saw recently, there's actually some unrest in the underground as unhappy employees of some of these ransomware companies have started to kind of divulge recent secrets and so on, which is really opening us up to see what's going on, the inside kind of scoop on how they're performing these attacks, the vectors that they're focusing on, and it's going to help us and other companies protect. So we are starting to see things unfold a bit as far as our ability to protect everyone against ransomware going forward.
Yeah, the moral of the story is even criminals need to worry about employee satisfaction, I guess, right?
Got it.
Yeah. Now, one of the other questions that always comes up with ransomware is whether companies should pay or not, right? And there is a school of thought that says, look, are you gonna, even if you do pay, is it gonna have the results you want? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk to clients about this a lot of times to start to think about whether you would pay or not. Even jpmorgan does, simulations where we discuss that as well. Consider situations where you may or may not pay. So part of it will depend on your ability to recover. Can you even recover? And then the other piece is really what's the value of either the data that they've encrypted or that type of thing. Because even if you pay ransom, there's no guarantee you're going to get that data back, or that even if you get access to your systems that they won't leak data or that type of thing. So there's a number of things to consider, your ability to recover as well as the value of that data and whether you should pay ransom.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think a lot of people think about ransomware as this very sophisticated kind of attack that's very difficult to recover from. In the end of the day, I always like to think of it as really it's just a specialized case of resiliency, right? It's the, how would you recover if you lost your entire data center, or an application went down, or there was a flood, or any sort of natural disaster, right? And if you're that dependent on that one copy of data, you have that challenge, whether it's ransomware or anything else. Right?
Absolutely. And we've looked more and more at, the concept of immutable backups that are offline that absolutely are not at risk of a ransomware attack or that type of thing. Because as you mentioned, one of the biggest things is your ability to recover. So what do you have from a backup, and your ability to recover will really help determine whether you're going to need to pay that ransomware or not.
Right. So a lot of activity. We mentioned ransomware, we mentioned supply chain attacks. What are the kinds of steps that companies can take to better protect themselves or prevent these kind of attacks, especially in the current environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously, the first thing you want to do is prevent. So prevent and protect. So a lot of what we see is just keeping up with normal hygiene, patching, keeping your systems up to date, implementing that layered security model, and the importance of multi-factor authentication is absolutely key in many of these examples. We talked about your strong data backup and your ability to recover. And then, especially when it comes to supply chain, is looking at that third-party risk. So ensuring you understand what third parties you're leveraging, that you've assessed to make sure they have the appropriate controls in place, because it doesn't matter if you have all the hygiene in place, if your third parties don't. That will come back to potentially impact you if there's a supply chain risk. In addition to protecting, detecting is just as important, because I think many of us have learned that no matter what you do, it's highly likely they're going to get in at some point. So the key is, if they do get in, is to detect that as quickly as possible so you can contain it and reduce the impact. So those two key pieces. And then finally, being prepared, as we've talked about. If you do have an attack, how do you respond to that attack? How quickly are you able to enact a playbook or a run book? Who do you engage? Who do you communicate with? Like we talked about, will you pay ransom? How would you pay ransom? And really thinking through that ahead. And that's very important to make sure that you're prepared for any worst case scenario, like we talked about, to be able to react quickly and put the right controls in place to address the situation.
Yeah, I think having a plan is always important. I think it was Mike Tyson who said everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So it's one of those things that things never actually go according to the playbook, right? So you mentioned things like simulations and other sort of exercises like that can get you more familiar with the process, right? Can you say a little bit more about how those work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we call them tabletop exercises or simulations. You're basically going through the exercise. It's that muscle memory. So you don't want to go through something for the first time in the middle of, a very chaotic event. So the more you've practiced and you've thought through those scenarios, and really, a lot of times when we do those, we go worst case and trying to think through how you would respond. So we do that internally as a bank, but we also do it with clients and make sure they've thought about the scenarios that could potentially impact them, how they would respond, who they need to engage with. Again, practice will help you in the event of an actual scenario. We're not going to be able to practice everything, and we know there's going to be different nuances you can never anticipate, but if you've thought through some of those more stressful situations, you're going to be better prepared when it does happen.
So as we said, supply chain attacks have been around for a long time, right? And, third-party oversight programs or third-party reviews have always been a part of any sort of corporate security risk program. Can you talk a little bit more about what companies can do about third parties?
Yeah, that third-party risk is very complex. So you have your standard third-party control reviews that everyone should already be doing, but those are typically point-in-time assessments. Beyond that, I think it's critical to really understand that relationship with a third party, which third parties have your data, which third parties are supporting critical processes for your company, as well as which third parties are providing you, now from a supply chain perspective, actually providing you software that you're ingesting and making sure you understand that process. We're seeing more and more third parties subject to these supply chain attacks or ransomware attacks. And immediately we look at what version of software are we running, what's the potentially compromised version of software with the third party, and making sure you really understand to that level of detail. And you do have to understand that third party in the context of your business risk, because there are conversations now to really understand your risk and whether it's worth outsourcing that much risk to a third party. Something you really have to take into consideration into your business model, because there is a higher risk as soon as you've handed something over to a third party.
It is an interesting conundrum, right? Because part of what powers innovation and makes people able to move so fast is being able to leverage that work that other companies have done on building on top of their success and not doing it all yourself, right? And I think it's important to distinguish between third-party software providers, which you just so eloquently talked about, in terms of making sure that they're not, that you understand their vulnerabilities and what versions of software they're running, et cetera, but also treat differently third parties that host your data or have other information there about your clients, right? And making sure that, that data is appropriately protected and encrypted, and that the keys for that encrypted data actually reside with you and not with a third party and things like that, because you don't want to be sort of subject to a sort of rogue employee at a third party, or they're getting compromised or things like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important within your contracts to make sure you have disclosure information so that that third party is required to disclose to you if there is any sort of compromise or attack, that you're rapidly notified, especially for those who are holding your data, so that you can assure that, the right controls are in place, your data has not been compromised, or if it has, you're now enacting your playbook for potential data compromise of your client information.
So back to COVID. And obviously a lot of change over the last year and a half. And maybe we've seen sort of a reduction in the number of COVID-themed kind of attacks, whether it be fake PPE equipment fraud, or whether it be attacks against things like the PPP program or things like that. But as much as it's been, great for people to build these sort of flexible work arrangements and remote working and hybrid working and everything like that, that causes risk as well, right? So can you talk a little bit about any risk sort of created by the number of people working remotely?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the good news is that we've all, I think, significantly uplifted our remote working environments and a lot of those capabilities that we might not have had before, or the level of security has significantly increased for those work from home environments. I think when we talk about going back to the office, we need to be prepared. If you have systems that no one's logged into for 12, 18 months, you have to be ready to make sure those are patched and secured and up to date, as well as, we talked early on about that toil and that real kind of chaos that happens when we change our schedules again. And, people are trying to figure out those hybrid schedules or the return to the office. That's when we become much more vulnerable to those attacks, because our guard's down a little bit as we're switching environments, and we need to make sure that we continue to educate our employees and make sure they're aware of, those phishing attacks or, whatever it might be during that period of change.
Yeah, I think another thing to think about is, just as you worry about making sure that devices in the office are taken care of, how do you make sure that those systems that are remote, people's laptops at home, are appropriately patched, aren't subject to malware, aren't, don't have, bad passwords? You really are, on the one hand, you're giving everybody the ultimate flexibility. On the other hand, you're putting a lot more of your company's security in the hands of all of your employees remotely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, making sure you have the right tools to monitor for that. And obviously, the bank, we're in a virtual environment, so it helps us secure that much more so. But even for myself, when we first started to work from home, we were sharing devices, and, chances of my fifth grader, clicking on something malicious on a device I'm sharing with him was much higher. Especially, you remember, at any given point in time, we were getting a text that said either click here or else your package won't be delivered, or you haven't paid your bill for your streaming service. Click here, it'll be disabled. Both of those were potential to be crises in my household at that time. So it's actually surprising that we didn't fall victim to one of those. But all those types of risks in that mixed environment between home and work are real. And there, a lot of it's around education of your employees, basic hygiene and protection of your home network, your home PCs, that type of thing. It doesn't cost a lot to do that awareness, but you have to just keep doing it and really make sure you've built it into your programs and that your employees are very aware of the controls that they need to have at home as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because as much as people like to think about cybersecurity as this big, sort of highly technical issue that you need some sort of big fancy piece of software or whatever to solve for, at the end of the day, it really does come down to basic blocking and tackling, right? It's user awareness. It's making sure you have good hygiene around things like authentication and passwords and things like that. It is about making sure that, systems are appropriately patched and things like that as well. Because at the end of the day, it's phishing, it's malware, it's all the same sort of attacks that have been at us for years, right?
You got it. And we do a lot with our clients, because we do feel like that general awareness is so important. And we have so many examples, being as large as we are. So those real life use cases are very impactful when you understand how there's been a business email compromise situation and you've incorrectly rerouted money to someone else. That's happening every day, and to be able to share those use cases and how you prevent that, and really the general awareness and training is key, as well as, like we talked about, the simulations. So putting them through some of those examples, how would they react, what would they do, and so on, is just doesn't cost a lot to make sure to educate your employees.
Finally, Annie, you've been in the space for a long time, right? How have you seen the role of the cybersecurity professional change over the last 5-10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, funny enough, Anish, I worked for you many years ago, and you were in a similar role. So I'm actually going to turn the table on you. How have you seen it change, working across cybersecurity, technology, and so on?
I think that historically, cyber was thought of as this thing that the security team dealt with. And then over time, I think it became more of the technology organization more broadly dealt with. And I think now it's generally viewed as a broad-based issue for everybody, right? I mean, we talked a lot about awareness. We talked a lot about end users being sort of the first line of defense around this. So I think that's probably the biggest change I'd see around this. Is one other thing is I think the level of visibility that the issue has gotten is much greater now. It's become much more of an issue in almost every boardroom, right? 10 years ago, when I was the CISO, we used to go to the board, once a year, and now our current CISO is there almost every other month, if not more so, right? So I think it's something that's getting a lot more attention. It's something people sort of realize it's kind of an existential threat to a lot of firms, and one they have to take very seriously.
So Anish, I absolutely agree. And there's no doubt that we're going to continue to see an increase in the number of attacks or an increase in the sophistication of the attacks. But we've also increased our ability to identify those vulnerabilities, monitor and detect. So your cyber book of work just continues to increase. So I think that's why it's even more important for the CISO to be at the table, because they need to be able to understand that risk in context of the business and make sure we're prioritizing the right things, and that we are addressing the highest risk areas based on the business processes, the threats in the environment, and so on. So to your point, it's no longer understanding cyber in the context of just technology. It's understanding that broader cyber risk to your entire company and your business, so that you make sure you focus on the right things, because it's going to continue to evolve. It's going to continue to change. There's always going to be more than you can do. So you got to focus on the right things.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, Amy, thanks very much for joining us today and for sharing your insights on this incredibly important topic.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anish.
And to all of our listeners, remember, if you enjoyed this episode, you can rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Tune in next time.